September 1941. The German Army Group North had reached the outskirts of Leningrad. After 3 months of blitzkrieg, tanks stood just 40 kilometers from the city that had once been the pride of the Soviet Union, the cradle of the revolution. From the north came the Finnish divisions, reoccupying Karelia. From the south, the Wehrmacht sealed the last railways. By mid-September, Leningrad was completely encircled. Inside the city, the reality of siege life descended like a shadow. The food warehouses at WWII burned after Luftwaffe bombings, taking with them thousands of tons of grain and sugar, the city's winter reserve. Panic spread, but evacuation was impossible. 3 million people were trapped: soldiers, engineers, artists, mothers with children. Daily life transformed overnight. Parks became defense lines. Statues were buried to protect them from shrapnel. The grand fountains of Peterhof were drained and camouflaged. Even the Hermitage Museum wrapped its paintings in cloth and sandbags, preparing for the unthinkable. But surrender was forbidden. Stalin's orders were clear. Leningrad must stand. And so it stood, surrounded by iron, facing famine, frost, and death. The siege had begun, and no one imagined it would last for nearly 2.5 years. The first winter of the siege was one of the coldest in memory. Temperatures dropped below -30. Electricity failed, water pipes froze, and the trams stopped running. People tore down wooden fences and furniture for firewood, yet still could not keep warm. Bread became the only currency of life. The official ration was reduced to 125 grams per person per day, half of which was sawdust and cellulose. Long lines formed before dawn in the snow, and often the bakeries were empty when the doors opened. People collapsed in queues, frozen where they fell. In the silence of the city, strange sounds emerged. The whisper of wind through broken windows, the slow toll of artillery in the distance. Entire families disappeared overnight, leaving only frost on their windows. Cannibalism became a whispered reality, unspoken but known. Yet amid despair, life refused to die. Teachers still gathered children in cold classrooms. Musicians of the Leningrad Philharmonic played in gloves, rehearsing for Shostakovich's 7th Symphony, a symphony that would soon travel beyond the siege as a message to the world. Leningrad lives. By January 1942, the frozen surface of Lake Ladoga became the city's only connection to the outside world. Across that expanse of shifting ice, convoys of trucks, polluterki, began to cross. Each night they traveled without headlights, guided by faint markers and the moonlight. German artillery shelled the route constantly, and Luftwaffe planes strafed the lake during the day. The drivers called it the Road of Life. They risked everything to bring flour, kerosene, and medicine into the starving city, and to carry out the weak, the children, the sick. Many trucks broke through the cracking ice, disappearing forever beneath the surface. Yet for everyone lost, others kept coming. By spring, more than 500,000 people had been evacuated across the lake. Supplies came in barely enough to survive, but they sustained the heartbeat of a dying metropolis. The frozen route became not just a logistical lifeline, it was a symbol of defiance, a thin vein of hope in a frozen world of death. In 1943, Leningrad was a skeleton of its former self. Streets were filled with ruins, burned trolley cars, and the faint smell of ash that never left the air. Yet beneath the rubble, life pulsed stubbornly on. The Kirov plant continued to produce tank components in underground workshops. Women operated lathes by candlelight. Students worked in shifts at munitions depots. On the front lines of the Neva and Volkhov, Soviet troops held the city's outer defenses, launching desperate counterattacks through the snow. Every day the city was shelled. Every night the survivors swept glass from their window sills and carried on. On January 18, 1943, Operation Iskra, Spark, succeeded. Soviet forces broke through the blockade south of Lake Ladoga, opening a narrow corridor only 10 kilometers wide. Through it, rail tracks were built in weeks, and for the first time in 16 months, Leningrad could breathe again. But the siege wasn't over. It would take another year before the German forces were finally pushed away. Still, for those inside the city, hope had returned. The red flag rose once more over the Kirov works, its color muted by snow but burning with resolve. January 27, 1944. The roar of Soviet artillery thundered across the frozen plains. After 872 days, the blockade of Leningrad was completely lifted. The soldiers of the Leningrad and Volkhov fronts met in triumph. The German lines collapsed, leaving behind their guns, their trenches, and their dead. But victory came at an unbearable cost. Over 1 million civilians had perished, more than in London, Dresden, and Hiroshima combined. The city streets were lined with silent witnesses, burnt trams, empty cradles, and endless names carved into frost. There was no celebration. The people were too weak, too broken. Bread was distributed in the streets. Some wept, some simply stared. Yet in the quiet, there was pride. A grim, unyielding pride that the city had never fallen. In the years to come, Leningrad would rebuild stone by stone. Its symphony would play again, its lights would shine once more on the Neva. But the memory of those 900 days, of hunger, of courage, of unbroken spirit, would live forever. The city had survived not by strength, but by the will of its people. The second winter arrived like a silent executioner. By December 1942, the city was already hollowed by famine. The first siege winter had killed hundreds of thousands. The second came for the survivors. There was no wood left to burn, no roofs left intact, and no one strong enough to bury the dead. The Neva lay frozen, a silver scar beneath the pale northern sun. People dragged sledges piled with corpses to mass graves. The cemeteries filled faster than anyone could record. Entire apartment buildings stood empty, their doors swinging open in the wind. The streets were haunted by silence, the kind that comes when even the birds have starved. But Leningrad still worked. The radio still broadcasted. The Red Army still held the lines. Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, smuggled beyond the siege months earlier, had been performed across the world, from London to New York, turning Leningrad into a global symbol of endurance. The people inside the city didn't hear those ovations, but somehow they felt them. And so, amid death and darkness, life continued. One ration at a time, one heartbeat at a time, waiting for the thaw that might never come. No group suffered more than the children. They were too young to fight, too weak to flee, yet old enough to remember every sound of the sirens and shells. Thousands were evacuated over the road of life, but tens of thousands remained, pale, skeletal figures, wandering the courtyards in search of food. Teachers kept diaries instead of lessons, writing of pupils fainting mid-class, of empty seats that would never be filled again. Many children became messengers, delivering orders or water to defense units. Some joined the fire brigades, carrying sand to extinguish incendiary bombs. Those who survived grew up in a world without childhood, where lullabies were replaced by artillery and bedtime meant another night of hunger. Yet even in this abyss, the city's schools reopened when they could. Small groups of students sat in unheated rooms, their breath visible in the air, reciting Pushkin and Lermontov. The idea was simple. If children could still learn, then civilization had not died. They were the smallest defenders of Leningrad, and its purest symbol of hope. By mid-1943, the German blockade tightened again. Heavy artillery batteries, positioned around Pulkovo Heights and Tosno, rained destruction daily. The city's skyline, once crowned with cathedrals, became a jagged silhouette of ruins. Yet the defenders refused to yield. Anti-aircraft crews, many of them women, operated their guns through blizzards and bombardments. Hospitals were set up in cellars, where surgeons worked by candlelight, performing amputations with vodka as anesthetic. In the nights, the faint glow of burning oil tanks reflected on the Neva, a ghostly shimmer that made the river seem alive. Every bridge was mined in case of invasion. Every citizen knew where to report if the Germans broke through, but they never did. Despite starvation, disease, and the cold, Leningrad stood. The city had become more than a place. It was a fortress of the human spirit, defying annihilation. When the thaw came, it revealed not victory, but survival. And that was enough. In January 1943, the Soviet command launched Operation Iskra, Spark, the long-awaited attempt to break the siege. After weeks of artillery preparation, the Leningrad and Volkhov fronts attacked simultaneously from opposite sides of Lake Ladoga. The ice cracked under the thunder of tanks and gunfire. The fighting was fierce and relentless. German bunkers lined the frozen forests, their machine guns cutting through the snow. Soviet infantry advanced meter by meter, losing thousands for every kilometer gained. But on January 18th, the two forces finally met near the settlement of Schlisselburg. The blockade had been pierced. For the first time since 1941, a narrow land corridor connected Leningrad to the rest of the Soviet Union. Supplies began to pour in, and a railway was built across the reclaimed zone in just 17 days. It wasn't full liberation, but it was life. Inside the city, sirens wailed, not in warning, but in celebration. People wept openly in the streets. The worst was not over, but hope, real, tangible hope, had returned. 1943 became a year of endurance. The corridor opened by Operation Iskra allowed limited supplies, but the city remained under constant shelling. Every day, dozens died from bombs, and hundreds more from hunger or disease. Still, Leningrad rebuilt while under fire. Bridges were repaired, streetcars returned, theaters reopened in the ruins. In the Tauride Palace, cultural workers held small performances, while underground presses printed newspapers to keep morale alive. The Leningraders no longer dreamed of comfort, only of lasting one more day. On the front lines, Soviet forces launched offensives to widen the corridor, but German resistance was fierce. The siege dragged on, and winter returned once more. For many, it felt endless, a war measured not in victories, but in survival. And yet, survival itself became victory. By the end of 1943, the Germans were in retreat across the Eastern Front. The city sensed it. Liberation was coming. But it would demand one final storm of fire and sacrifice before the dawn. In the depths of hunger and ruin, Leningrad created one of the greatest acts of cultural resistance in history. the performance of Dmitri Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony. Written during the siege and completed in evacuation, the symphony returned home in the summer of 1942. The city had barely enough musicians to perform. Many were dead, others too weak to hold their instruments. Yet under conductor Karl Eliasberg, the survivors gathered in the Philharmonic Hall. They rehearsed wrapped in coats, collapsing from exhaustion between movements. On August 9th, 1942, the symphony was performed. Soviet artillery units coordinated with the event, silencing German guns so the music could be heard. Loudspeakers broadcast it across the front lines. For those in Leningrad, it was more than music. It was a declaration that the city still lived, that even starving, it could create beauty. German soldiers later recalled hearing the symphony echo from the city they had failed to conquer. It was, as one officer wrote, the sound of a people who will not die. By late 1943, the siege entered its most violent stage. The Red Army prepared for a final offensive, and the Germans answered with ferocious bombardment. Artillery shells rained daily. Over 100,000 struck the city that year alone. Fires consumed entire districts, while snipers haunted the ruins. Winter came again, turning the city into a frozen labyrinth. Food supplies improved slightly through the narrow corridor opened by Operation Iskra, but hunger still ruled. Soldiers on the front lines fought knee-deep in snow, trading ground for lives. Civilians continued to work in munitions factories hidden beneath the city, their hands numb, their stomachs empty. In these final months, the line between life and death blurred. Survival was measured in grams of bread, in degrees of frostbite, in hours between shellings, yet morale remained unbroken. The enemy could burn the buildings, but not the will that had carried Leningrad through 2 years of siege. January 1944. The Soviet High Command launched Operation January Thunder, the decisive push to liberate Leningrad once and for all. Artillery batteries unleashed a barrage so intense it could be heard hundreds of kilometers away. The frozen ground trembled beneath the fury of thousands of guns. Soviet divisions advanced from the south and west, tearing through German positions. The siege ring shattered piece by piece. Villages that had been silent for years came back to life under red banners. German resistance crumbled, their retreat turning into chaos. Inside the city, civilians crowded the embankments, watching the horizon flash with the glow of battle. They knew liberation was coming, and with it, the end of their torment. On January 27, 1944, the guns that had surrounded Leningrad fell silent. For the first time in 872 days, the city was free. Liberation brought no celebration. There was no strength left for joy. The city had endured the longest siege in human history, but at an unfathomable cost. Over 1 million civilians were dead. Hundreds of thousands more were crippled by starvation or frostbite. Mass graves covered the outskirts of the city, most without names, only numbers. The Piskaryovskoye Cemetery became sacred ground, where survivors gathered to weep in silence. Women placed small loaves of bread on the snow as offerings for the dead. Rebuilding began immediately. Workers cleared rubble with bare hands. Trams rolled again through shattered streets. Children returned to schools without glass in the windows. The city moved forward, not out of triumph, but necessity. Leningrad had survived, but it would carry the memory of the dead in every brick, every street, every silence that followed. In the decades after the war, Leningrad rebuilt itself from ashes. The palaces of Peterhof were restored, the theaters reopened, and the music of Shostakovich filled the concert halls again. But the scars of the siege never healed. Every family had a story, every building a ghost. The people of Leningrad called themselves blockadniki, survivors of the blockade. They carried ration cards in their pockets for years after, as reminders of the hunger that had once ruled their lives. The city received the title Hero, City of the Soviet Union, yet its true heroism lay not in medals, but in endurance. 900 days of hell had forged something unbreakable. The Siege of Leningrad became more than a chapter in history. Tesson in humanity's capacity to suffer, to resist, and to endure. Even today, when the wind crosses the Neva, it carries the echoes of those who refuse to surrender. Leningrad did not merely survive. It taught the world what survival means.